Hi, folks. Welcome to Opening Doors. I see folks starting to. Oh, I see folks trickling in here. Welcome. Let me know where you're watching from. Feel free to use the chat as we go. Tell me where you're watching from, and feel free to comment or throw in thoughts, questions along the way. We'll try to share some as we go. I am extremely happy and honored to be joined tonight by Kelly Hall-Tompkins. Kelly is a classical virtuoso solo violinist, which is new territory for this series. We have mostly so far had people that are kind of in my wheelhouse, and either in the sort of Americana, folk, blues, singer-songwriter, countryish range, and some folks in the family music range, and these are kind of my bags. But tonight is our first of several, I hope, over the years here, guests who is coming from a very different genre. Kelly was the lead violinist in the last Broadway revival of Fiddler on the Roof, which is a pretty big deal, Grammy and Tony nominated production. She's the winner of a Naumburg International Violin Competition honorarium prize, and she was featured in the Smithsonian Museum for African American History. She's also a pioneer for social justice issues in the classical music sphere, and we're going to be talking tonight about a project that she started a number of years ago called Music Kitchen, Food for the Soul. And there's some pretty amazing stuff happening and coming up, including a performance at Carnegie Hall in March, which we will be talking about. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Kelly.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad to have you. We met through some of the Grammy. I like to refer to it as Grammy nonsense. The sharing your recordings with other performers. There's a lot that I don't love about that, but one of the things that I do love is that it sometimes puts me in touch with artists like yourself who really are from very different backgrounds. And I think we sent each other albums probably almost 10 years ago, and I was really struck by what you were doing, especially the fiddler stuff. When did that album come out, Kelly?
That album only came out in 2018. I think we might have met with my Imagination album, which came out in 2014. Mm-hmm. So not quite 10 years ago, but so my fiddler album was 2018. It was a couple of years after we closed the production, and but from the creative team from our production. So yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Fiddler. We'll kind of work backwards from that, because as a non sort of, well, first of all, full disclosure, I played cello for 10 years. I think I've told you this.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, this was my big claim to classical music fame. It stopped when I was about 18, helped me get into college, and then I dropped it. And I wish I hadn't, because but I had a brief, I sat in the very back of the Westchester Youth Symphony performance at Carnegie Hall. So I got to sit on that stage one time. Didn't cut the mustard in general, though. Found a different calling. But fiddler speaks to me so much. My mother's Jewish. I come from a very culturally Jewish family in New York. And, fiddler, that's some biblical epic kind of stuff. What's your relationship with the show? When did you first discover it, and tell me about the audition process and all that?
Well, I was invited to be the soloist for Fiddler. And I actually, believe it or not, everybody was Tevye in high school, except for me. I did not actually discover the show until I was invited to be on Broadway. And I remember my mom and I set out to watch the 1971 film, the one starring Chaim Topol. And we both absolutely fell in love with the whole story and of course, Chaim Topol was amazing. And I didn't see how it would be possible for any production to exceed that wonderful, wonderful film with the orchestrations by John Williams. And yet, my experience on Broadway, discovering it in real time and place, was incredible. Our production and our company was incredible. Danny Burstein as Tevye was incredible. Jessica Hecht as Golda. And so I had discovered it there through, on screen, but then I discovered it viscerally in real time, while bringing it to life in our production, our Bartlett Shear production. And it just was one of the most amazing personal and professional experiences of my life.
And your performance, I'm going to throw up our background here, which I forgot to put up before. Your performance is amazing in it. Now you weren't on stage though. You were off stage fiddling, and then there was the role of the fiddler was miming to your fiddling. Is that right?
Exactly. We had, our fiddler production had the most athletic person playing the fiddler of most productions. He was a dancer that was flown 72 feet above the stage. And even the other dancers in the production could not all sub for him. There was only one or two of them that could do the flying. So it was a very specialized role. And Broadway scores for Fiddler on the Roof don't actually include a lot of violin solos, but because of my background as a classical soloist, they wrote new solos into the production for me, and then the director, Bartlett Shear, restaged the fiddler's role more and more to complement what I was playing. And so I took on the role unofficially of helping Jesse Kowarski to look more like he was playing in his choreography. And now I've taken that. Now I've been invited to do that in a more official capacity for the touring company, the touring version of our production. So I've done that now three years in a row. And I just completed that for the tour that's about to start.
Wow. So you've really become part of the history of this show now. And it's a big deal, this show. I'm really curious. You grew up in South Carolina. Mm-hmm. When you discovered the show late, and you were saying you were watching it with your mom, besides the music of it, how did the story speak to you? It's an interesting kind of cultural cross stream, right? I mean, this is a story about minorities in an oppressed minority in Russia. I'm curious how, when you first experienced the film and the musical, how it spoke to you.
Well, really, it's a story that's a crossroads of many issues. I mean, it speaks to women's empowerment, the three daughters, and deciding, having agency and having the right to determine the destiny of their own lives. And then also, of course, the being ostracized and put in danger as a marginalized community in a larger culture in Russia. And yeah, that spoke to me immediately. And the pogrom scene is, I never, even on Broadway, we played the show almost nearly 500 times. And I never stopped being absolutely stricken by watching the pogrom. And I always made myself, stand to watch as, more than I was already on a perch where I was elevated so that I could see the stage and interact more. But for that, I always stood in some kind of, I don't know what it was, a reverence, and also a needing to fully absorb the magnitude of what was happening on stage every single time, because I had a solo right after that I wanted to embody the tragic scene that we just had witnessed. It resonated with me on many levels. I actually had already self-published the Holocaust memoir of a dear friend of mine, a neighbor nearby here in New York. And that's something that I was involved with on his behalf for years. And I still shepherd that project, even though he's no longer with us. I worked on it, actively for over 10 years. And, even my husband said when I started Fiddler, he's like, isn't it ironic? Don't you think there's a little bit of Alfred in all of this? And I absolutely did. I mean, it just was an incredible synergy and irony to be working on that project. And then, of course, I got to go to, during actually, no, it was after our run. I was part of the Fiddler documentary that came out just before the pandemic, Fiddler: A Miracle of Miracles. So I got to go to the Ukraine and walk into essentially that story in in place.
Which I still have not seen. It's actually before I had you lined up to be on this. It was on my movie to watch list, and I want to share. It's on Amazon.
Amazon Prime is the place where you can see the full film. For some reason, PBS decided to cut the film in their version, and my scenes are totally eliminated. But the full film is on Amazon Prime.
Okay, I'm putting the link in the chat here for folks who want to check that out. Yeah, and Lin-Manuel's in it.
Yeah,
as well. I would love to get to some music. Can we? You have a piece from Fiddler, or a piece? Is it a piece from the show, or this is a piece that was inspired by the show?
So my album, The Fiddler Expanding Tradition, is the first ever solo album from Fiddler on the Roof. We usually are hearing this music in the context of the musical, and I set about to create an album of the music. Most of the pieces are individual songs, just like you would hear them in the musical, but they're reimagined. They kind of, excuse me, they encapsulate our the actor's interpretation and my interpretation of their interpretation in our production. But they also have a reason to exist without the words, and a reason to exist in an instrumental context only. The piece that I will play next is actually the only one of those pieces that's a bit of a medley from Fiddler. It is, so it's inspired by, but you will recognize the most iconic music from Fiddler, the tradition theme, excuse me, Sunrise, Sunset, and To Life.
Okay. I put the link. It's a ridiculously long link to the Amazon but all they have to do is Google Fiddler Expanding Tradition and Kelly Hall-Tompkins, and you will find the album. All right. People put some love in those comments.
So that is typically accompanied by my band, my fiddler band, guitar, bass, and accordion.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So if you want to see the full version of that, you can see my music video on YouTube.
What should they look up? What is it?
If they will go to they can look up Fiddler Rhapsody, Rhapsody, or they can look at my YouTube channel, which has all my music videos going back to the original, which is how we met with the Imagination Project, released in 2014. So yeah, check it out on YouTube. But that was from I think I released that video in 2016 during our production.
Well, my dad gives it thumbs up here.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, what an incredible piece. And to see the technical, this is I play with a lot of very talented people who spend a lot of time practicing, but you work in a very technical field. You have to put in a lot of hours to keep those chops at the level that you're at. You can't just sort of get by with your personality. How many hours a day do you practice, or a week?
Generally four plus or minus. Yeah, 4 is my target. Sometimes more, but depends.
Yeah.
It takes that long to do what I feel like I need to do.
Yep. 4 hours a month is good practice for me. But I have a winning personality, Kelly. How did you get into this music? How did you discover classical music? What's your story with it?
Well, as I mentioned, I grew up in South Carolina. There wasn't anyone else in my family that was playing it, in the house or anything like that. But I did grow up Lutheran, and in the Lutheran church, there's a lot of music by Bach, a lot of Baroque music in general, and I think that was sort of going into the mix. And then on Saturdays, I had Warner Brothers cartoons where there were a lot of not only standard works of classical music, but also just really dynamic original works written for Warner Brothers. And I just was kind of enthralled with the timbres and the orchestration and the marriage of music and movement, with the animation. And then I think all of that was sort of percolating around, so that when one day my elementary school class took a trip to hear the Greenville Symphony, I was hanging over the balcony and I was totally transfixed. And in fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I remember that the orchestra was playing a piece that had a big violin solo that's very iconic. And I just was so taken with that. That is Scheherazade by Rimsky-Korsakov. And I just, the violin sound really spoke to me above anything else. And so after that, our elementary school had a visit from a string quartet. And that was, at that point, I was done. I said, that's what I want to do. Okay. And I didn't even fully know what that meant, but I just knew I needed to play the violin in my life every day, and that I wanted to do it as a career.
All right. Now here's a key question for our conversation. When you went to that orchestra performance, did you see anybody who looked like you?
I don't remember, because I was transfixed by the music itself.
Interesting.
And I have absolutely no recollection. I probably saw other kids, because it was probably, being in the middle of the day, it was probably an educational concert for the school district. So I probably saw other kids in the district, unlike a typical concert, a public concert in the evening, which is a little more specialized audience. This was probably a concert for kids. Right. So I probably saw other kids that looked like me, but it was not a feature of my perception. It was not a feature of my memory. All I could think about was what I was hearing, what I was seeing.
Interesting. And then you started to play. what about in your, well, first of all, what was the town you grew up in and the school you went to? What was your school like? What were the demographics like? What was the racial makeup?
When I started playing violin.
Yeah, and in your elementary school or, in those early
Uh,
years.
I think in my grade school in general, I'm not 100% sure of the percentage at that point, but I would say that by the time I was in high school, and probably similarly, we were probably African Americans were maybe 20%. So it was definitely a majority white district, and I'd say we were 20% or less. Some probably less.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, growing up, my orchestral experiences, growing up in Westchester County of New York, my town didn't have a lot of racial diversity, but in the greater Westchester area, there was a lot. And I was in, I never made all state, but I made all county several years, and I was in the Westchester Youth Symphony. And I mean, I could be wrong, but I can't remember any black or brown kids uh, in with me. On the other hand, um, going to a school where there wasn't a very large Asian American population either, that was a racial distinction that was very clear to me. The orchestras I were in were the number of Asian Americans involved in orchestras were much higher than the percentages in the county. Of course, I wasn't thinking these ways, but culturally for me, it was a different experience. It definitely felt like I'm in a different mix of kids. But when I think back, I can think it was very white. It was fairly Asian, but I can't remember black and brown kids.
Well, in my state, I was. I definitely remember there being other players of color. I kind of distinguished myself early on, and there was a dichotomy between the people that were in the class, orchestra class at the high school. I ended up going to a fine arts school at high school. So I went to my regular high school for my academic classes only, and then I went to this specialized school by audition in the afternoons. And I do remember that there were I left behind some players of color in the orchestral class at the school who did not pursue it at that level at the Fine Arts Center. But in my state, I was the concertmaster of both all-state orchestras, junior all-state and senior all-state. And by the second time, I won the concerto competition. So I don't think I was the only one, but I don't recall. You know what? I might have been the only one, but for this reason. I remember in junior all-state, actually, that although my friends from the Fine Arts Center were also in the all-state orchestra, we wanted to be housed together because they housed people with host families at that time. And somehow somebody got it in their head that I would be more comfortable, even though I grew up with two professional parents and I was, blessed to be have a suburban lifestyle. People thought that I would be more comfortable with a family that was in a housing project. And it was a little bit of culture shock for me. It wasn't something, I definitely relate to people of all income strata, and that's really not the issue. But I think they wanted to take me out of the familiarity of my own cohort and put me into one that they thought was appropriate. And that was a little bit of a jarring experience. So for that reason, I suspect that I might have been the only one because I don't remember anybody else having that experience.
Yeah.
But by the time we got to senior all-state orchestra, I don't have any recollection, actually.
I mean, that in and of itself is interesting that you don't have a recollection. It seems you were very focused on the music. It clearly spoke to you. Yeah.
I was acutely aware I became more and more aware of the culture surrounding classical music and how it can be constructed to exclude. I started to become more aware of that as I became the youngest member of the professional orchestra that had inspired me to play in the first place. I auditioned and became a member of that orchestra in high school. And at the concerts, I loved those concerts. I loved the music so much. I was so glad that that was my job as a teenager, to play in an orchestra. I was so proud to do that. But I started to observe just the culture of what I could see in the audience, and who was present and who was not present, those sort of things. But it was never a barrier to me internally. I was focused on what I wanted to do with music, and there was nothing external that was going to come between me and that.
Yeah. Although, I mean, let's continue as you got older, because as you continued your career into professional music, there were some barriers. From the brief conversations that we had before this, you've had some experiences which I think are really necessary to share. I think there's a lot to learn from them, and I want to just give a little background for. I've been doing some more reading about orchestral music, because this isn't my territory, and I listened just last week. If anyone else caught on Fresh Air, Richard Antoine White gave an interview. He has a new book called "Impossible," and he's a tuba player for the New Mexico Symphony, I believe, and he has an extraordinary story, very different from yours. He grew up in dire poverty. He was homeless, discovered the tuba, was placed with a family, adopted, and started a career. And Richard.
I do, yeah. He's extraordinary. I mean, yeah, he's an amazing person.
Hearing his conversations about this and some of his audition stories, but just some from the New York Times a few years back. This was an article in the Times that were saying American orchestras remain among the nation's least racially diverse institutions, especially in regard to Black and Latino artists. In a 2014 study, only 1.8% of players in top ensembles were Black. Just 2.5% were Latino. Now, you hipped me to, there was a statement on racial discrimination from the League of American Orchestras that came out last year, in August of 2020. So after George Floyd, what was that statement about, and what's your take on it?
I think this statement was extraordinary. I mean, I think that because we were all at home in a most unusual way because of the pandemic, we were homebound. The country and the world had finally did not miss the opportunity to witness some of the extraordinary cruelty and injustice that's been going on all along. And so I think that most of the field, as with the world, responded to that that obvious injustice that we had all witnessed, for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And then all of the other, that's unfortunately but one example, what happened to poor Mr. George Floyd. But I think that one of the most shining examples of statements that came out of all of the organizational responses to that was the League of American Orchestras. And I thought it was a very strong, admission of whatever role that body has played in specifically the anti-Black racism that has, propagated in the field. I thought it was I think that in general, there's a lot of what I call vacuous hand-wringing about, how do we fix this problem? And we'll set this committee and then we're done with it. But I did get the sense, I was very taken with the League statement, which just said that, we take responsibility for the lack of representation in all of its forms, from our, the way that our partner orchestras behave, to programming, to the audition process, to, just all of the various ways that our influence in the field has allowed us to get to this point. And I thought it was just an extraordinarily strong statement. I haven't seen anything else quite like it. And it was really heartening to see at a very challenging time in American history, really.
I mean, this is a through line with this series. Um, every genre I think is going through its own reckoning, and this is happening across American society. And it's it's always going to be too late. But it's heartening to see that these conversations are happening. It feels to me like conversations are happening in a different way, but they're happening in each genre, each organization, each segment of American society is the starting place is very different. Classical music, um, as an outsider, what I think of, what I do is sort of often considered sort of low culture in America, and orchestral music is high culture. Um, there's a sort of formality about it. Um, at least up here in the North, I associate it a lot with sort of liberalism. Although, and that's another through line here is where do white liberals fall down when it comes to solving these problems? One of the, but I think there's probably a lot that I don't know about the conservatism of segments of classical music. One piece of background here, and I think this is something I really want to talk to you about. And this is unique in some ways to classical music as a genre, is the auditioning process. As I understand it, for years and years and years, the auditioning was done, out in the open, and it was very much an old boys network. You'd get auditions based on who you know. People would put in a good word for their buddy. And the not surprising result of that was that American orchestras were overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. And in the early 1970s, there was I think there had been pushback for many years, but there was pushback that finally was heeded, and a new system was put in place for American orchestral auditions, that there would be a blind audition process. So at least for the first several rounds of auditioning, people would play from behind a screen. And the result of this was that the representation of women over the years increased quite dramatically, but it didn't increase in regards to Black and Latino musicians very much at all. Right now in our current time, there's now a push to take down some of those audition screens, to say that, it's one thing to say we don't want to give advantages to old boy networks. It's another thing to say, if you want to change the culture of something, people need to be able to see themselves on stage. Or orchestras, there's a role to play for being more proactive about not just being blind, but actually proactively seeking diversity in orchestras. But you have a story about auditioning for an orchestra that, to me, goes a whole step further than that, because you won an audition essentially and then didn't get a job. Can you tell
Yeah.
that story?
Well, I will. I want to say one thing about that discussion that is moving away from the screen, and that is for a few reasons. For the reason that you already mentioned, and also because that screen process has pushed American orchestras towards a soulless perfectionism that doesn't actually express artistry as in the same way anymore. And I think that there is a push to sort of, break down the building blocks of just sort of searching for the best typist on that day, that can type in all of the letters, all the keys without making a mistake. But yeah, there was, and I know something about this process and this whole discussion because I started my career in orchestras. I left an orchestra to pursue a career as soloist, and that's what I do now. So I have a different relationship to orchestras. But early in my career, I was a master's student at the Manhattan School of Music in their orchestral studies program. And I studied with the concertmaster of the New York Philharmonic, and I was a runner-up at the New York Philharmonic at one point. But a few years later, when I was just out of school, I did another major orchestra audition. And that particular orchestra had a screen process for all three rounds: the preliminaries, the second round and the final round. And that orchestra also has an objective numbering system whereby the scores that are simply tabulated, and above this threshold, whatever the threshold of the number, a person wins the audition, and below that threshold, they do not. And I definitely remember when you start that process, you're in a room full of lots and lots of people. And I remember feeling like the personnel manager looked straight through me as he was addressing the group. I think, in the ways that human beings kind of, unconsciously focus on the people that they think will be significant in a given situation. But as the elimination rounds progressed, I kept being there. I was still standing in this audition process until finally after the finals, I was declared above the winning threshold. There were 3 of us, and 2 of us were above the winning threshold. Therefore, we won the audition, and 1 person was just below that threshold. And it was explained to me that the music director had 6 weeks to decide whether or not to hire us. And it was presented as a formality. It wasn't really any.
For one position, or for?
It was for 3 positions, actually.
Oh.
Yeah. And there were 3 positions. There were 2 previously advertised positions, but when we got to the audition, they said that there was actually a 3rd. And so after that process, I'm looking at real estate, thinking I'm going to be making a move. And, sorry, I said 30 days. 30 days the music director has, but it was actually 6 weeks later that they called me and said, and I quote, "I'm sorry, but the music director is not interested in hiring you." And that was after, a grueling and not to mention expensive process of flying to an audition, preparing and actually clearing the bar and doing the, what is required and actually passing this objective threshold. And what made it even more stunning is that I found out later that the person who did not cross the winning threshold was hired along with the other person who did.
I mean, it's an amazing story, Kelly. I mean, when you look at the state of affairs with the audition process, you can see how orchestras would say, the reason we don't have diversity is that we have these thresholds and we have blind auditions. And every time we take the screen down, what we see is a white face. It's not our fault. And that's, which is very debatable. How much is your fault? And there's a lot of nuance there. And you mentioned that the technicality. The New York Times article that I read too was saying that in the last 30, 40 years, the top level of talent has increased dramatically, so that what you end up with is sort of a group of musicians at the top tier, and the differences between them on any given day it's minutia. That you sort of you have tens of people maybe, or, you may have several people applying for a job, all of whom can fill that slot very admirably. So picking one person already seems like you're splitting hairs. It seems sort of random. How did it sound on that? Who was listening, whatever. But to then take down the screen and have a face of color and then not choose, it shouldn't be surprising, but it's remarkable. How many years ago was it?
Oh, it was some years ago. It was like, I want to say 20 years ago. But I don't think that anything has effectively, I don't think a lot has effectively changed. And I'm not the only person that has happened to, but I think that in that particular orchestra, but I think it was, as you mentioned, a very big missed opportunity to actually take some action against all of this vacuous hand wringing that I mentioned that sort of happens in the field. But I think for me personally, I have a completely different kind of career in a different sector, standing in front of the orchestra now. So I think it ended up well, but I think for some people and for myself initially, that is a dream crushing thing to have to endure. It's a tremendous amount of work and expense, as I mentioned, to prepare these auditions. And yeah, I mean, obviously there are orchestras that seem to be getting it right. You know, there are a lot of orchestras that just say, oh, it's impossible. When we take the screen down, there are only white faces there. But then there are other orchestras like the Met where there are several Black players in the orchestra. It's, you know, an elite orchestra. So what are they doing? What are they doing better than many of the other orchestras? I think the players are out there. And then admittedly, it also is a very, very specific kind of training. Orchestral playing is a very, very specific kind of training. It's a very specific kind of playing. And again, as things sometimes go in the direction of that soulless perfectionism, it can really train out a lot of individuality, particularly in section players. So I think that not everyone who plays on a high level necessarily plays in a way that orchestras are interested in for the way that they have conducted their, you know, their sensibilities, the way that they have prioritized their sensibilities. But I think that that is among the things that orchestras are kind of reevaluating right now, just how that affects.
And that brings up another big area of discussion around diversity with orchestral music is what are their standards and what are they playing? What, you know, who are the composers they're playing? What's the lineup of music? How do they demonstrate? You know, there's a lot of ways of doing this, and there's ways that have been there in place for long periods of time. And it's, you know, I was listening to local NPR radio here, and I hear the BSO is, like I imagine many orchestras across the country, is grappling with this issue too of how can we change some of our material? How do you create a balance where you want to keep the folks who keep wanting to hear Mozart, you know, pleased, but also bring in new audiences? And that's one of the things that strikes me about this is that the idea of bringing diversity into an orchestra, or having an opportunity to hire somebody like yourself who's jumped over all the hurdles. It seems, you know, there's a moral issue, an equitable issue, but there's also a self-survival issue. I mean, American orchestras, my understanding is that for the most part, with maybe the exception of the top few, many of these orchestras are really struggling in America to keep patrons, to bring in new patrons, to kind of keep themselves alive. And I mean, I can't think of anything that helps them stay more relevant than helping change what their lineup looks like, what kind of music they're presenting.
Yeah, I think it's ironic that that's another thing that the field has been grappling with. You know, the phrase that audiences are dying, I mean, or that audiences are dwindling, I should say. And I've been hearing that since I was in high school. And I don't think that, I think the audiences are the same, you know, as they have always been. And if you look to the same places, the audiences will be the same. But the irony is that they don't look to new places for the audience. And we'll talk a little bit, I guess, a little bit later about my organization that does do that. But I have to say that I love what has been heretofore defined as the canon, the classical canon. I love that music. That is the music. That's the siren call to me. I love Mozart. But I also realize that Saint-Georges has been skipped over in history. One of the most stunning historical examples of raw talent and genius that has sort of been, you know, skipped over wrongly. I think that is also true. But I adore Brahms. I adore Beethoven. I mean, I love what has been called the canon. I just think what the new thinking is just that the canon should be a little more inclusive. You know, why is it that so many orchestras don't program, you know, works by women? You know, I hate to say the word female composers because it's just composers who are female. Why is it so hard to find? And when that does happen, it's a special event. It's kind of, you know, highlighted in a way like, look, we have a woman composer, you know, rather than here's our program. So I don't know. I think some of those things are really hard to break out of the traditions that have been the way they've been established. And there's another really interesting story of something I experienced. And when I was doing the Naumburg International Violin Competition, I was also on tour in Asia. I mean, I was just before the competition, I was going on tour as concertmaster of the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra. And so there was a whole lot going on. I had these enormous programs to learn for the competition. And on that program, I included a work by, on one of those 3 recital programs and 3 concertos, I included a work by George Walker, a very august and celebrated African-American composer who I'm proud to say became a friend for the latter years of his life, but unfortunately is no longer with us. But the day that I met him, I had wanted to play some of the stuff that I was preparing for the competition for him. But as I mentioned, it was such a busy time that the best that I could do was to take him to lunch, because I thought, here is this Pulitzer Prize winning composer just across the river in New Jersey, and I need to know this man. And so when I reached out and invited him to lunch, thank goodness he actually accepted. And we had a lovely conversation at the lunch, which I don't recall the details of, but I will never forget the conversation we had as we were going to my car. And he started asking me a list. Do you know this concerto? And I said, no. Do you know that concerto? No. Do you know this, that? Like, no. And it turns out he was listing concertos by composers of color. And he looked at me, and I didn't know a single one of them at that time. And he looked at me and he said, I'm sorry, but your education is incomplete. And I was completely offended. And I was like, I went to the Eastman School of Music. You went to the Eastman School of Music. What are you talking about? You know? And, but it was really not until that point that I had thought so much about what was absent, because, well, first of all, classical music is mine. I am not an borrower of it. I'm not an interloper to it. I am not it belongs to me, and I've never had any confusion over that. But in terms of there being composers represented in the curriculum that I was presented and studied, there wasn't any of that. And I didn't even think to question it until that moment. And that was a kind of catalyst moment for me in my life and in my thinking about it. Now I'm, among all of the pieces that I'm a champion of, I'm also a champion of works by composers of color. And, but and I think that it's not, that story is not to point a finger at the Eastman School of Music, which is, I think, the backbone of my education, and it's an incredibly wonderful institution. I think that all conservatories up until this grand reckoning that we're now in the midst of, or past, I'm not sure. It seems sort of like we're in the denouement of the grand reckoning. All of the conservatories and all of the orchestras are just beginning to think, how can we expand our concept of what the canon is, or how do we be more inclusive? Right. I think it's just something that didn't happen before. The fact that he was a Pulitzer Prize winning composer of that institution, and we didn't study his music. It's true. In the classical field, also in the folk and roots field, we're talking about music that's hundreds of years old. We have so much of it. We have such a vast array. And it's true that there are pieces that we just will never have time to cover. But I think what we are talking about is not doing a sort of a charity coverage of certain composers, but rather those who were really pivotal in how the music evolved and why the music became what it did.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So he was obviously contemporary. He's older than you, but contemporary. Were the other composers he was talking about, were they all 20th century composers?
They were not necessarily, but the irony is that at that time he was so blowing my mind that I can't even remember the name of the composers he mentioned. I think one of them might have been Cordero, Latin American, I think. But anyway, it was so mind blowing at the time that it was this list of, he might as well have been speaking Greek. And I have, I speak several languages, but Greek is not one of them. So
I mean, yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I want to get back to having you play a little music, and we absolutely have to talk about Music Kitchen, soul, music for the soul, uh, food for the soul. The work that you're doing in that space. I want to give people a chance to learn about that. I could keep talking. I mean, I find it fascinating. Classical music almost definitionally seems like inherently it feels like there are problems in a genre that even the name classical sort of requires looking backwards, and I wonder, like, when people are what are contemporary composers in this space called? Is it called contemporary? Go
Well,
ahead.
I think there is a kind of an overlap of terminology that makes it confusing. There are a lot of people who disagree what we should call the music, but I think that one thing that's important to point out is that there is a classical period, but classical music refers to a kind of more formalized version of some of the folk traditions that occur in music. So we talk also about classical Indian music because there's something, I don't know, I'm not an expert on Indian music. I love it, but there is some, musicologists will assign some level of complexity and formalization to music that makes that leap. We have all kinds of music that is influenced by folk traditions. Bartok is one of those examples. A lot of the Hungarian composers, Kodai, Zoltán Kodai, they took a lot of the Dvorak even took a lot of the dance music or the rhythmic popular music and put it into a more formalized type of scoring that does not adhere to a dance. It may move in and out of references to that music. So the terminology is a little bit confusing because when we talk about classical music, we're not just pointing to a period, but we're talking
Right.
about that. So even contemporary composers are called contemporary composers of classical music.
Right. Um, yeah, and that pulling from folk traditions, see, that to me is the really cool thing that happens. If Beethoven did it, the
Yeah,
Ninth
everybody
Symphony,
did.
and here in our country we had Aaron Copland, um, people who did that here too and made fantastic music. But to me, like the next iteration of where do you look for material, I think about like Duke Ellington. Like this is our, but it seems often that music will get ushered into the pops version rather, like here in Boston, the Boston Pops might play stuff that really speaks to African American history here in our country, and it sort of can seamlessly work in that material. Where the BSO, that divide seems almost like they're stuck. Like, well, we can't quite go over there because that's what the Pops do.
And Duke Ellington is one of the great American composers. But I'm actually really excited that I am playing, I'm working on and will perform in January, the Violin Concerto of Wynton Marsalis. And oh my God, does that piece go everywhere? It goes everywhere.
Wow.
It's this enormous, wonderful piece of music that displays his incredibly vast ear for the classical canon, as well as it goes straight into the music that he plays. Well, he plays everything, of course, but the references to to Barber and Stravinsky and and also there's a blues movement. The ironic thing that I think is really funny about, and we were talking about the terminology, when music references folk traditions, I think it's so funny when I ask audiences sometimes, oh, did you hear that total blues section? Sometimes they're like, no, I didn't hear it, because of the way that classical music can refer to something without going all the way there. We are trained to hear those influences across 1,000 years of musical development, but they don't always translate because they're not the raw thing. But I think in this amazing concerto by Wynton Marsalis, he goes all the way there, and all the way he encompasses so many styles of music, and in this brilliant piece. So I think, it's not dead.
It's amazing. I recently listened to an interview with him. I have some of his jazz albums. I love his work, but what an incredible mind. Really, he is standing at the crossroads right now with his Jazz at Lincoln Center project of jazz and classical. How exciting to be able to work on that.
Yeah.
Would you play us another piece?
Sure.
And then let's talk about Music Kitchen afterwards. All right. While Kelly is setting up here. Oh, here she comes. Okay.
So I just wanted to explain briefly what this piece is. This piece was written for me during the pandemic by Ellen Tafe-Zwillik. And on the topic that we were discussing before, violence against African Americans by the police, not just to poor Mr. George Floyd, but also to others. And there was a young man named Elijah McClain, who, when I was playing my scales in front of the news, I saw him also holding a violin. He played as an amateur, but he loved to play the violin. He played for the kittens at the local animal shelter. He was a gentle soul. And should still be with us, but tragically was taken too soon. So this piece was written by Ellen Tafe-Zwillik for me, and it's called A Little Violin Music in memory of Elijah McClain.
Wow, that is beautiful. Can you tell us, before we get into Music Kitchen, can you tell us a little more about who the song was written about, or who the piece was written about?
Elijah McClain. He was a young man in Colorado, I believe. I want to say Aurora, Colorado, and had a fatal encounter with the police one evening. It's all on video. He wasn't really doing anything, but they decided he looked suspicious, and he was given some kind of medication by the police that ultimately stopped his heart. He was really young, too young for that to have been for there to be any doubt as to the cause of his death. And yeah, as I mentioned, as far as I'm aware, he was just this kind, gentle soul, and he loved to play the violin. He played the violin for kittens at the local animal shelter, so they wouldn't be lonely. And it actually occurred a year before what happened to George Floyd, but it was only because of and in the wake of what happened to Mr. George Floyd that we ever had a chance of knowing about Elijah McClain.
Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to the power of music and to your specific style of music. How haunting, and that piece does go there in that way we were just talking about. That little blues section in there is very clear.
Yeah,
I know those notes.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Well, let's talk some about Music Kitchen, because this is a project that you started in 2005. Is that right?
Yes.
And what you're doing is bringing classical music into homeless shelters and sharing music with people experiencing homelessness. And there's been 100 performances, or they're more than that.
More than that now. Yeah, we are the pioneer organization to regularly make a program of bringing classical music to those experiencing homelessness. And when I started that in 2005, it was, there were more challenging discussions to have about why that's even necessary, and should it be funded, and all of that kind of thing. And I broke through all of that. And yes, 15 years later, we have presented over 100 concerts. We've reached, we have presented over 200 top artists, including luminaries like Emmanuel Ax and Glenn Dicterow and the principal oboist of the Berlin Philharmonic, all who are very passionate about the program, and many, many emerging artists who may or may not be household names, but are just incredible artists and players. And we've reached an estimated 30,000 shelter clients. So it's not something that I ever anticipated doing in my career, but it is one of the, one of the most profound things about my career. And I really enjoy bringing music to people who would otherwise not have access to it. Sometimes they did prior in their prior lives, but sometimes they've never heard a live note of music ever in their lives.
Yeah.
So,
There's you have an upcoming performance, a world premiere at Carnegie Hall that's come out of this project. I want to talk about that and put up some information about it, but let's first, there's a short video that shows a bit of the power of these concerts and the way people are experiencing them. So if I can figure out how to do this.
oh, great.
Here we go.
I never knew that classical music can be that touching, that real. I didn't realize that it was that powerful.
I want to take the voices of marginalized people and cause paradigm shifts in how people think.
It felt like a warm embrace. It really felt like the music engulfed me and held me tight. I didn't know music had that power.
If I was to tell my life story, it would probably be your music. Your music's kind of sad, but kind of happy in the same way.
I was drawn to these particular words because I felt like it was a prayer. This person who wrote it was very grateful for being alive despite all the hardships.
These are the people that bring my music to life.
It's always a special occasion when a piece is performed and listened to for the first time.
This project was very special to me. It kind of helped me to reach back and to really remember that the music is much larger than me.
I was like, we got violinists playing. I was like, these aren't just regular violinists. They're like the Supremes.
It celebrates and uplifts often overlooked voices that we need to hear from, voices that share stories of struggle, hope, and humanity.
How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Have a passionate belief about something and pursue it and never let it go.
Wow. What's a great video, and what strikes me watching that is, I mean, you are accomplishing through this project many of the things that we've been talking about. I mean, you're bringing classical music to new audiences. You're bringing different people performing who look different than we often see on stages. There's a lot more diversity among the performers and composers featured in that short than we often see in orchestras. You're hitting both ends at once with this project. Pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and that's this is not a diversity project. This is a project to make forgotten voices heard with the highest level artistry that I could assemble. And I think that's something that you notice really it demonstrates to any of those doubters out there that it can be done, and that you can accomplish both. I'm really, really excited about this project. It's one of the most profound things that I've ever experienced in my career, that I've ever created in my career. And it basically takes the 15 years of first 15 years of Music Kitchen's history and features the feedback, literally the vernacular prose feedback that we received from the shelter clients, and paired it with award-winning composers. In classical music, we tend to take the high art of poetry and marry it with the high art of music composition. Poetry by celebrated, marble-busted, folks, and this kind of thing is unheard of. Classical music likes to venerate a romanticized version of, the common people, as long as they were hundreds of years ago, but doesn't have a way to relate to people that are finding their way and that are struggling in our midst in our time. And it is my hope that this project will bring to life in a whole new way the people that are around us that are in their most vulnerable place in life. And I think that the pandemic has really torn the veil back as to why such a project is necessary. I think, it has exacerbated inequities and it has revealed inequities. And obviously it's shown to a certain extent the tenuous hold on stability that everyone has, to a certain extent. Not just financial in nature, but also, emotional in nature.
Yeah, I mean, you're really demonstrating by example here, and that's often what's required, right? When people say you can't do these things, to show them that you can. It's one thing to say it; it's another thing to do it, and you're doing it. And in the ultimate cathedral of classical music, Carnegie Hall. So tell us a little about this, about the world premiere on March 31st.
Yeah. So just to tell you the context, my plan with these 15 songs by 15 composers in celebration of Music Kitchen's first 15 years, we decided to roll these pieces out in a way that would prioritize the shelter clients. So starting in January of 2019, we premiered each song individually in a homeless shelter around New York City for the shelter clients before the public. But during that time, I was really excited that when I presented this idea to Carnegie Hall, they loved it. And they immediately came on as a partner to ultimately present the full song cycle of 15 songs at Carnegie Hall. And it was obviously just like any other thing in our lives, it was to have happened in 2020, in May of 2020. But I'm really, I'm very moved and excited that through all of the losses of this time, that this concert remains a priority for Carnegie Hall, and that we have, we are rescheduled and on the books for March 31st. And it will be, bringing forgotten voices to one of the world's most celebrated concert halls. As you mentioned, I call it the People's House. Sometimes people use that term, that moniker for the White House, but for me, that's Carnegie Hall. It's the People's House. So what better place to bring that message? And I think, to be honest, they're the perfect partner for this, because Carnegie Hall has been demonstrating an interest long before this grand cultural moment and this reckoning. I think that the reason that they were so receptive to the project is that they already have been thinking along the broader lines of inclusivity and reaching broader audiences. And so I'm really pleased that, Music Kitchen has been doing the work before. It's not a side endeavor. It's the entire reason that Music Kitchen exists. So the artists that I engage, myself and others, we play all over the world. But for the sake of Music Kitchen, we perform behind closed doors for the shelter clients. But through this unique and very unprecedented and historic project, we are taking the message of those first 15 years and the people that are marginalized into the recesses of society. And we're bringing that message straight to center stage in one of the world's great concert halls. So I'm really excited about that.
It's an incredible project. And it's not too far for people from Boston to get down. It's a good excuse to get down there in March.
Thank you. Perfect.
Or
for something historic, of course, you make the trip, right?
You make the trip. Little holiday gift idea. Music. Can you get tickets at Music Kitchen website?
No, you get tickets at Carnegie Hall website, carnegiehall.org, and you can search Any three things will get you straight to our. I mean, I can also put the link in the chat if there's a public chat, if you wanted to put that up. But if you want to go to the carnegiehall.org website, you can search Music Kitchen, search Forgotten Voices, or search Kelly Hall-Tompkins, and you will see that concert.
I'm gonna.
Do you want to put that in the chat?
I am.
Okay.
Here it is. Carnegie Hall, Forgotten Voices. And I assume you can buy tickets from here. We go. Will there be will some of the homeless clientele population be in attendance for?
Yes, I'm really excited. We hope to sell out the rest of the hall as soon as possible. So buy your tickets now. But I am very pleased that we have worked with Carnegie Hall to set aside tickets to make sure that we can work with our partner agencies to invite shelter clients, current shelter clients at that time, to the concert. So yes, absolutely. We would like to have the broadest possible representation in the hall, and that includes the clients that we've served, and that includes classical connoisseurs and people who've never heard a live note of classical music, and students, and we really want the world to pull up a chair and see this historic event.
I may make the trip down myself.
Awesome.
I'm going to put this up one more time too. I put it in the chat, the link, and I hope people will check it out and also spread the word. Maybe you have friends down in New York who need to know about this.
Definitely. And you can also share the trailer that you just saw. It's on YouTube. So if you go to Music Kitchen's YouTube channel, you can find that and share that trailer as well.
And I believe I put the link in there as well. Yes, bring the classical to the people. That's where it came from. That was your point, was that's where we've turned this, the history of classical music has turned something that really was the people's music into a very high art form, very formalized. But that is the roots of it, just as it is with folk music and blues music, and unveiling that, the intersection between that, sort of bringing it back to its elements, what this music came from, and increasing diversity, equity. They seem very much to go hand in hand. They're two separate endeavors that have the same sort of endpoint.
Well, the music historically has the same challenges that we have today. While the musical influences themselves come from very populist and folk influences, there are the structures and mechanisms that made classical music possible through its history were determined in many cases by monarchies and the wealthiest lines of societal control and privilege, and those things are all true. But in our modern era, we have a little bit more awareness and education about the inclusiveness of a broader range of people, and we have the ability to put that to use in an entirely different way than our predecessors. Right.
Well, and we all saw Amadeus. We know he took it to the people in the People's Hall there when he couldn't get his piece, the magic flute. He couldn't get it played in the Royal Hall. He took it to the streets, right?
And unfortunately, and very unfortunately, he never made, to be like probably the most known name on the lips of any person who knows anything about classical music, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He did not live the life of comfort and stability. He never made enough money. He was always at odds with his employers, and he never got a royal appointment. So that tells you a little bit about what what changes over time. Sometimes our perspective changes. He was certainly highly revered, but not in a way that ever made him, gave him the status in his lifetime that he now enjoys posthumously. Mm-hmm. To the contrary, the Black composer that I mentioned earlier, Joseph Bologna, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, was a star by all accounts, and it's really an unlikely story, that he was both the fencing champion of Europe for 10 years, from the age of 17 to 27. He was a friend and a teacher to Marie Antoinette. He was the conductor of the leading orchestras in Europe of the day. Even our own President John Adams said, this is the most famous man in all of Europe. Even though he never actually met him, he knew enough about him that he wrote this. And that everybody wrote about Saint-Georges in his lifetime. Everyone. He was such an incredibly highly respected historical figure, and just to the opposite of Mozart, in part because of Napoleon, who decided that he didn't want this black man to be celebrated in French history, burned his scores and banned the performance of his music, partially because of that. But it's exactly the opposite story of Mozart's. He had everything. He had every privilege and he still suffered from the racist laws of France, but he lived a very charmed life in his lifetime, and he was known internationally, far from his home of Paris. And yet now we are only having a resurgence of knowledge about this man. And so it's exactly the opposite. So history can be very capricious, and it's subject to the prejudices and the limitations of the day. But again, I say we have the awareness and the presence of mind and the education to go beyond some of those limitations.
That really, I want to, we need to wrap up. I want to do a little book homework here, or what's the word for it? Make some acknowledgments and talk about who's coming up. But it actually, what you were just talking about, and is it St. George, the last name?
Yeah, there's so many names. Joseph Bologna Chevalier de Saint George. Yes.
De Saint George. Okay.
Yeah.
That the story of his fame at the time, and then the fact that we don't know him now, most of us, jives exactly with the story of Bert Williams, who was in the late 1800s and early 20s. He lived until 1922. He was the most famous performer in America in the vaudeville era. He was a black man, and what's complicated about him is that he performed often in blackface because he was forced to. But he too was referred to as the most famous man in America at the time. He made more money than the president. And and this isn't a genre that's much closer to what I study and pay attention to. And I had never heard of him. That he will be one of many names that will come up in the next conversation that I have here on Opening Doors. I'm going to be talking with Briar and Joe Siemens. Briar and Joe are part of a project out on the West Coast called the Rhapsody Project, which is actively doing anti-racism work in music education. And I am sitting in right now on a class that Joe is helping to teach that is unveiling some of these stories. It's a program called Face the Music. And it's looking through American folk and blues, Americana history, and looking at some of the trends and some of the people that have been overlooked through time, thinking about acknowledgement, how music was co-opted, and credit and fame were given often to the wrong people, very often white performers playing music that had originated with black performers. So Joe and Briar, besides being great musicians in their own right, have a lot of knowledge to share with us. I'm really excited to have them on, and we'll be talking about that class, the Face the Music class, and that is, I just had it up. That's December, so we're going to be skipping over kind of the Thanksgiving time. So there'll be no show in November, but we're going to have early December, and then in January, I will have on Tom Prasada Rao and Leah Morris, two songwriters working in the folk general field, two great songwriters, both of whom are writing a lot of activist and political oriented music. Tom wrote a song called $20 Bill about George Floyd, which is a fantastic song. We'll talk about that. Our friend Mark Orelli, who lives here in Melrose, covered it recently for a show that I did. So I'm looking forward to having them on. And then two friends of mine from the family music world, Shine of Shine in the Moonbeams and Saul Paul, are two performers who have a foot in the children's family music field like I do, who also have feet and hands in a lot of other pies, both enormously gifted musicians who are doing really important work with kids among the various things they're doing. And that's in February. And I want to, I will hold this up at the end too, but I want to thank the Melrose Unitarian Universalist Church here in our hometown and the anti-racism team in particular, and especially my co-producer on this show, Stacy Babb Weinberg. And that's most of the stuff I need to do. I want to show one more time that you can get tickets for Forgotten Voices at the Carnegie Hall website. You can support Music Kitchen, Food for the Soul, directly at the Music Kitchen NYC website. And sorry, I left you up for this. Normally I give guests a chance to go hide a little bit. So I'm so sorry, Kelly.
Okay.
But I want to put up one more time too. The way this series works is that the Melrose UU Church anti-racism team has put funds towards this series to pay performers a base rate to come and share their knowledge and experience in music and expertise with us. But none of us ever gets paid enough for this. Speaking on behalf of all musicians everywhere, all the time, forever, except the really famous ones whose names you all know. The rest of us are scrambling to make a living. And you can support Kelly and thank her for being here and sharing with us so much information and talent tonight. And she will split half of those donations with Music Kitchen, which supports the work that you've already learned about. Okay, that just about covers all of this. Thank you so much for being here and really giving us some new stuff to chew on tonight for me and my crowd.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm glad that it hit the mark, and I really appreciate your interest. And thank you all for attending tonight.
Thanks, Kelly. I will see you down the road.
Definitely.
I'm going to end by putting up our end credit here. And we will close the show out with that. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight.